Hi, I'm M.
And my name is Bea.
And this is
Fangirls Anonymous. A quick warning, this podcast is not for kids.
We get into some pretty explicit stuff.
But if you're still with us and into that, welcome.
Hey Bea, how's it going?
Hey M, it's going pretty good. How about you?
I am excited. I know I say that every episode, but I am pretty excited about talking about these fics and stuff. We're going to get into our very mysterious past a little bit here.
Congrats, if you made it this far, you have unlocked some of our backstory.
And you didn't have to pay anything for it. So, we thought it would be cool to talk about some of the fics that kind of impacted us on our fic reading journey as people. Hopefully it's interesting. I think it is. Because it's going to be a little bit universal if you read fic as well.
There's always that moment when you're reading that you encounter a fic that you're like, I wonder, I'll see what this is. And then when you're done, you're like, wow, my entire view has changed slightly. Like how I approach fic or this fandom or just what fic means in general is sort of different after you've read it.
Yeah, I would say that every fic we're talking about this episode is a perspective shift for us.
Definitely for me. I definitely came away from it having learned something. There was a moral lesson to be had.
In other words, it expanded our horizons.
I'm going to start off with one that I read ages ago now. Actually, most of these fall under that. It's called Gravity's Got Nothing on You and I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm not sure how to pronounce this name, but zosofi? Feel free to tell me how you think that's pronounced, or if you know, please tell me. I would love to know. It is a Teen Wolf Steric fic. It is a fake relationship. Styles and Derek end up pretending to be boyfriends in order to fool, I believe, Derek's family, and in so doing end up falling in love is sort of the heart of the story. There's also a co-plot, I guess. It's not really a subplot. It's a parallel plot about a magic item. And the reason that this one taught me something is because at the time that I had read it, I knew absolutely nothing about the Teen Wolf fandom. Zero. Nada. So in approaching this fic, I was like, this just seems like an interesting concept. And so I went ahead and I read it and I went, hey, this is really fun. I really enjoyed this. Again, knowing nothing about these characters at all. There is a character called Deaton that I did not even guess his race correctly. But having said that, I still enjoyed the story and it made perfect sense. It was an AU, so there were some things that were obviously very different from the show, but they also sort of, because of that, didn't need the explanation that perhaps a canon compliant story might have. In fact, not knowing the show, other than obviously not imagining these characters correctly, I didn't really lose anything. And so I came away with it with the knowledge that if I wanted to get into fic in a certain fandom, I didn't actually necessarily initially have to be part of the fandom or be knowledgeable about canon at all. I could just sort of dive in with something that looked interesting, and I could always figure out after the fact. I read a fair amount of Teen Wolf fic before I ever watched anything about the show.
Did you end up watching the show?
Not all of it. I watched
Same.
select episodes.
Did the fic inform you about the show, or did the show inform you about the other way around or something like that?
I came from the fic to the show, so I was expecting... Well,
Derek
honestly, it's an MTV show, so I wasn't expecting quality. But I was expecting something, I think, at the end of the day, a little bit more tightly scripted than it was.
A little bit better.
Yeah, and well, I was neither surprised nor particularly disappointed with the show. I'm probably never going to put a great deal of effort into actually sitting down and watching it. I think that the world of the fandom has created for it and the narrative that they've sort of pared down out of the show ends up working for me a lot better, with or without the romance elements added in. But again, fandom has a tendency to sort of be like a river polishing the stone that is canon. Like...
So
it's been they've run through that story so many times. They really have figured out what works.
I completely agree with you on that. So my first fic that taught me something is titled Angels Wild by Limonade Gabby and Rise of the Fallen One. Rise of the Fallen One is like a prolific writer in the Supernatural fandom. It is a Destiel AU from Supernatural, the show. And it was one of the first fics I ever read that was really long. When I first read it, I remember it like thinking, holy crap, this is the longest thing I've ever read. And it's almost 400K. So, like, that's 10 novels. Like, average length of a novel is like 40K. So, it's about a world where Dean's father thinks that angels, who are like this other type of human species that live on the earth, murdered Dean's mom, his wife. And Dean grows up learning how to be an angel hunter and hunts angels and then falls in love with one. It's very Romeo and Juliet. It's sweet. And they live to be like 300 years old, and they have this culture, and it's very cool. But I remember in, I think it was our crack episode, we talked about wingfic as one of those topics that people used to call cracky, and now not so much, just because crack has changed. Go listen to the episode, it's really interesting. And this is one of the first fics I've ever read that had wingfic stuff, like involved with like sexy times in the fic. So that was cool. I just reread it. So I guess I've just realized that maybe I've become a little bit more discerning when it comes to reading fic in general. It is a good fic. It's long-winded. It's 400K and it's one story. Like, it's not War and Peace. But I think that I have learned how to pick and choose the really, really long fics I want to read. I used to just read only long fics when I first started reading fanfiction. And now if I don't like it and it's really long, I won't read it anymore. And I didn't used to do that. I used to just muscle my way through 400K fics because I was like, this has to go somewhere. They wouldn't write this much if it wasn't good eventually. But I'm not saying this isn't good eventually. I'm all over the place, but this is an interesting, weird, good fic. But I've realized maybe I'm just a little bit more discerning when it comes to reading fanfiction nowadays, especially if I'm putting all this effort into it because it's really long. That's what I've kind of learned from this fic.
The next one that I want to talk about is a little bit complicated. It taught me a lot of different things. So it is called Never Leave a Trace by Copper Badge, and it is a white collar fic. If you are familiar with White Collar, you know that it's a show about a white collar thief who ends up getting caught and working as a criminal informant for the FBI. So the fic is about the thief and his handler, and they end up getting placed on a case where there's some form of corruption inside of this prison, and they need to send the thief back to prison in order to figure out what's going on, and his handler will end up following him and pretending to be a prison guard so that it remains safe, and he'll eventually get out again. And it's this really interesting magical realism story. But the things that it taught me are, first off, the ship in this one is an OT3, and it's between the thief, his handler, and his handler's wife, which is actually really cute. But it was interesting because this is one of the first times I encountered an OT3, and it was sort of a little bit of a light bulb moment for me, like, oh, instead of a triangle, we could have just 3 people in a relationship. And that was a really interesting, different idea that took me a little bit of time to digest. And now that's one of my favorite things, is going, instead of a triangle, everybody loves each other. There's no conflict. Or, lots of pining, but no conflict. And the other thing that this one taught me, other than that I really love magical realism in fic, and I don't think that there's enough of it, is this is one of the first ones that I encountered as a fic that I read both as fic and also as an independently published novel of the same thing. So they took the story and they changed all the names, and in this case they also added more to the story, kind of filled in the gaps that a fic naturally has, because you assume that people know canon to a certain extent, and then published it as an indie novel. So it is also known as Trace by Sam Starbuck, and this is one of the first times I encountered the idea of filing the serial numbers off, or taking a fic and turning it into its own original novel or short story, whatever. And it's interesting because I've read both, and there are elements of the published novel that I adore, that I initially thought were in both, that are actually just in the published novel version. But having said that, there's still something slightly strange about it, because the original fic has this assumption of a certain degree of comfort between these characters. You know who they are, you're willing to accept the ship, which notably is not the main focus of the story. But in the novel, you have this brief glimpse of this romantic relationship, and then it sort of gets sidelined, and you're just like, okay, I guess I believe that? Why not? So it's interesting, because I was shown pretty vividly right up front that there are some nice things about filing serial numbers off, but there's also some things lacking. And that's always worth noting when you see something that you're like, oh, you could just change the names and get it published as an original novel. Well, actually sometimes you can't. And in fact, frequently you can't, because there's a whole narrative framework to prop up a fic that won't exist if you change all the names. So also just peripherally, for those of you who read fic, you might recognize the name Copper Badge. This was one of my first encounters with what I would consider a big name fan. Copper Badge has written so much fic, and they're an excellent writer. So I didn't know that at the time. I learned that after the fact, but it's definitely worth noting that, hey, big name fan, learned about it here.
What other fandoms are they in?
Oh,
What do they
geez.
write in?
I could not list them all. I know for a fact that they are in the Marvel fandom. I think they've done at least some Merlin stuff. I mean, if you think big fandoms, they've probably done at least one fic in it. They write a lot.
That's cool. So, my second one is called Little Lies to Get Me by Oh Captain, My Captain. The author is also known as Oh Captain, My Captain 1918, which is their name on Tumblr. It is a Stucky canon divergence, canon compliant, like MCU fic. It's actually, I would say, one of the most interesting canon compliant fics I've ever read, because the author really tries to make sure that the whole story could be interpreted from the films. So all the dialogue in the movies between Steve and Bucky is in the fic, but they're in love when they're talking that way. Which is really fun, and fun Easter eggs, like, you know, for somebody who really is in the fandom, all that jazz. So this fic taught me a lot about squicks. And if you want to learn more about squick, we do have an episode about squick. It's our episode 2. But I think in order for you to know that something squicks you out, you kind of have to be shown it first. You have to be exposed to it first in order to figure out that something squicks you. And this was one of the first fics I read in the Stucky pairing. And the Stucky pairing is one of the I think it's the third pairing I ever read. The first pairing I ever read was Bella and Edward. And then the second one was Destiel, and then the third one is Stucky. Stucky is Steve and Bucky, by the way, just to let you know. But this fic taught me a lot about a wide variety of squicks in general for people to have, and I learned what squicked me out. I still really enjoyed the fic. I have reread it multiple times. But I know that there are some things in certain chapters that I don't like to read, so I just don't reread that chapter. There are a lot of chapters. I think there's like 28 chapters in that fic. But man, that was good to know. Because it was one of the first fics I ever read, it allowed me to feel fine to skip certain things that I didn't like in other fics and not feel bad about it. Or maybe it kind of gave me a safer space to find out what squicks I don't like. Because it was a ship and a fic that I trusted, that it wouldn't like go into violence for violence's sake. And it was an author that I followed on Tumblr, so I knew that they weren't masochistic. It didn't seem that way anyway. So it was kind of a safe space for me to figure out what I did and didn't like when it came to long, involved, romantic, and very sexy fan fiction. And I think that's, if you are really into fan fiction, I think that there's like a fic for you or a couple fics for you that do the same thing. And I think it's a really good thing.
It's always nice to find an author or a ship or a combination of them where you're like, this is a safe place to figure out what I do and don't like.
Yes, exactly. I think that there are books and TV shows and movies that are the same way, probably. But fic tends to be a little bit more that way just because it gets into heavier or more banned topics than other pieces of media that need audiences.
So my third fic that I want to talk about is Phantom of Truth by Haiju. Like the last one, this one taught me a lot of different things. It is a Danny Phantom fic, and I'm just going to put a warning here that it is not a light subject. It's actually very much in the horror genre, and there's a fair bit of gore and body horror, so I will try very hard not to go in super deep about it, but if that is something that you avoid, then here's your warning. So the story is about Danny, who is a part ghost, part human, and spends his time fighting other ghosts as a sort of superhero. Well, he ends up getting kidnapped by a group called the Guys in White, who work for the government, and they want to figure out what makes him tick. And in order to do that, they enlist the help of Maddie Fenton, his mother, who is a foremost leading expert on ghosts. but she doesn't know that it's her son because he's in his superhero ghost form, and he's trying very hard to keep his identity a secret. So she ends up kind of experimenting on him, trying to literally pull him apart and figure out what makes him tick in a very horrific fashion. Well, he's trying desperately to stay alive and not let her know who he is and also escape. And there's some other things going on in the background, but that's the gist of this story. And this introduced me to some interesting things. First off, Danny Phantom is a kid's show, but this story is not a kid's story, so it was an introduction to the idea that there are children's media fandoms that have an older fandom participation, and it's a very different creature than in adult media with an adult fandom, or even and also obviously children's media with children in fandom. Very different. And I guess to strongly underline that fact is the fact that it's a horror story. Things happen to Danny in this story that would never in a million years end up in the show. So it's not wishing for this to happen in the show. It's not a fix it. It's not an obvious or strange extension of the show. It's somebody sitting down and saying, I want to write a horror story here, which initially was kind of a foreign concept to me. I'm not sure how many other people got into fic that were like, hey, fic is a great way to fix the things we don't like in canon, or at least change them so we like them better. And this one doesn't necessarily do that. It's not fixing anything. And arguably the things that happen in it are a lot less likable than what happens in the show. So it was just this weird space to encounter, to realize that, hey, this is not the childhood show I grew up with, nor is the fandom necessarily composed of people who want it to be. They're taking perhaps some of the themes and bringing them to their logical extreme, and that's what they're getting here. So it was interesting and weird for me to encounter this idea that of kind of a dark fic, something making things worse or creating less moral characters, whatever it is. But I also realized that despite the fact that it's a lot darker, I actually liked the narrative that they created within the story and its sequel a lot better in some cases than I actually liked the canon. Because again, it's a children's show. It was done in sort of a Monster of the Week style. There really wasn't any overarching plot to Danny Phantom besides sort of the premise of boy fight ghosts, vaguely superhero-y. And in this story, there was this very definitive narrative, especially in the sequel, where this author has put forth a lot of time and effort to. They have now pushed some of the premise to its logical extreme, and they've played up some of the horror elements that were in the show. And now the second piece deals with a lot of the backlash and the reactions from these characters, and sort of, again, drawing it out to the logical extreme in this world and building up the world in response to that. So it was a lot more tightly knitted. It had a better overall arc. It felt like these characters grew and changed, and there was something being said here. So I liked it a lot more, even though it was much darker than the original canon. And again, that was one of the first times I'd encountered that idea that, hey, I don't have to be in love with the original show to really enjoy the fandom and the narratives that are created there.
And that terrible things can happen in even children's TV show fandom fics.
Yeah, and in fact, my experience has been that the more adult presence is in a children's fandom, the more likely you are to get fairly terrible things happening in your fic.
That sounds really cool, and I can't wait to read it. Also, just to say, I had a huge crush on Danny Phantom when I was young. I think I was like 6 or 7 when the show was coming out, and I thought he was the bee's knees. Anyway, so my third fic is I Know That You Love Me Even When I Lose My Head by Luna Canis Lupus _22, which is a quote. The title is a quote from the song Guillotine, by the way. It's a good song. It is Aesteric, AU, and this is the fic. I don't think it was my first ABO fic, but I do think it was one of the first few ABO fics I read that I really, really loved. But when I first read it, it made me think of this concept that people in fanfiction, and I guess generally in fandom, use, which is Mary Sue. I just reread it, And I don't know if it's definitely not as Mary Sue as I remember it being. It is still a little bit Mary Sue, but it's good Mary Sue. I think there's a difference between good Mary Sue and bad Mary Sue. And Mary Sue is a topic we will get into, I promise. It's vast and difficult terrain. But this was a fic I read kind of in the middle years of how long I've been reading fic. I've been reading fic since I was 15 or 16. And this was the first fic I read where I was like, oh, now I understand what Mary Sue means. Because Styles in this fic can do no wrong. He's just that competent and that smart. Then again, we're seeing him kind of through the eyes of Derek, who loves him in this fic. So it's like, unreliable narrator. But I don't know. It's kind of hard to get into without really talking about the specifics of Mary Sue. But Mary Sue is kind of, people use it to say that character is too overpowered or OP, even though they shouldn't be from their characterization / past. There's other definitions too, but that's the one that I knew for a really long time. And that's what I used to think of when I first read this fic. And I guess this fic taught me how to look for specific tropes in fic. But then even later, when I reread it again, it taught me that even though I may have an initial impression about a character or a fic, that might not be true. It probably isn't true because I've gained more perspective and more life after reading it for the first time. So maybe the lesson is that I should reread fic and learn more about myself in the process.
It's always interesting to go back and realize that, hey, my perspective changed. Like, I definitely learned this thing from this, but now I'm also learning a new thing.
Yeah, and maybe that new thing is that you were wrong.
So the next one that we're going to talk about is one that we actually both picked because we both learned something from it, and we sort of independently came to the conclusion that this was one of the ones that really changed our opinion or our view on fic. So it's called Twist and Shout by
Gabriel and Standbyme.
Thank you. And it is a supernatural fic. It's Destiel. So the Twist and Shout is about, like I said, it's Destiel, but instead of anything to do with the show, they have done a complete AU where everybody has the same names as characters, but instead they are just humans who live during the 1960s, and specifically it's Castiel, who is a college student, and Dean, who is a sort of mechanic racer jack of all trades sort of a fellow, and they end up falling in love. And you think everything's going great, but one of the main things that happened in the 60s is the Vietnam War. And Dean ends up getting drafted, which obviously changes a lot of things in their relationship. And the story is sort of epic. It spans decades, and it's a beautiful, heartbreaking historical AU. And it's about Vietnam and about being gay, and it's a really, really good, very intense read.
I remember it having to do a lot with internalized homophobia as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. This fic completely changed my perspective on what fic was. Did that happen to you too?
I want to say yes in those exact words, but I feel like it didn't so much change my opinion of fic as it sort of it is so well written that it sort of makes a space for itself. Like,
Yeah.
you have never read a fic, don't like fic, this is still something that you should read because you could conceivably ignore all fanish connections and still come out of it sort of wowed by the story.
Yeah, if you didn't know what Supernatural was, this is basically a book for free online that you can read.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just one of those fics. You do not need to know anything about the canon. I will say that, so when I was 15 or 16, my mother started getting into a lot of Edward Bella fanfiction, Twilight fanfiction, and she was like, Miranda, you'd really like this, because I grew up just loving reading. So she was like, there's some free stories that you can read online. And so I found myself on Tumblr, which was kind of the space, and I would say still is the kind of the social media space for fic writers and readers. But so Twist and Shout became the first fic I ever read that wasn't from the fandom that my mom initially told me about. Twist and Shout was the first fic I read that wasn't in the Twilight fandom, so obviously that alone would have changed my perspective on fic. But because it was Twist and Shout, I suddenly realized, after like, halfway into Twist and Shout that, like, fic will get into really hardcore societal problems and issues, and it'll go into the Vietnam War. It'll go into internalized homophobia. It will go into
the AIDS crisis.
Yes, exactly. The AIDS crisis. Thank you. Man, I was 15. I had never read a novel before that ever got that hardcore into anything like that. I wasn't sheltered as a kid, but all of those things in one piece of fiction totally changed my perspective on not only fan fiction, but fiction in general. And I think that a lot of people reading that at the time, it was very popular and it still is today, but I think people reading at the time, I think would have agreed with me, most of them.
Yeah. I guess the thing that sort of drew me to it is that my first encounter was actually through fan art for the fanfic, not for the original canon, but for the fic itself. It wasn't just one or two pieces, it was a lot by different artists. And if you're familiar with the sort of give and take between fan art and fanfic, you'll know that there is fan art of fic, but it tends to be like one artist or maybe two sort of collaborating sort of with the author or in response to the author. And honestly, with few exceptions, there isn't a whole lot of art that goes with any one fic. But in this case, I was seeing a lot. So I was like, okay, what is this fic that has spawned all of this different art? So I went and I looked it up and I read it in 2 very long chunks of time, staying up way too late. And I was floored because this, like M said, was not a period of time that I felt is well addressed in my education, at least. A lot of my history classes sort of went World War II, and we're going to skip to 9/11. We don't have time for anything in the middle. Maybe a brief stop for the civil rights movement, but then we're trucking right along. And so having this story set in those decades was just, it really does floor you because it's so beautifully rendered. Just the struggle and the heartbreak that these characters had to deal with in order to be in love the way that they were. So it left an impression. It really is some of the best fic out there.
It actually made me cry. It is so important to the fabric of the fic community, in my opinion. So that's it. We did it. We would not necessarily recommend every fic that we talked about, but if you are interested in it, any of them, the links will be in the show notes. A lot of them are older fics, but I think if any of them, maybe read Twist and Shout, because if you haven't read it, then you're missing out. It's very
just be prepared with tissues.
You're gonna get super snotty. Like, it's an intense fic, but it's well worth it.
In that case, I guess we'll see y'all next week
on Fangirls Anonymous. Bye!